He stood under crystal chandeliers, smiling for cameras, raising a glass as the crowd applauded. Some people are meant to stay small, Ethan said, his voice smooth, confident. And then, she stepped forward. No one noticed her at first. Just a woman in a simple black dress, quiet, composed. Clara, the woman he erased. The woman he forgot. The room shifted when the host took the mic. And now, we welcome the lead investor behind tonight's biggest acquisition. Silence. Then her name. Clara Whitmore. Ethan's smile cracked. Because every deal he celebrated, every success he claimed, had been signed by her. And he had no idea. Until now. Some people are meant to stay small. The words floated through the ballroom, smooth as champagne, drawing a ripple of approving laughter beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers the size of small cars, their light scattering across marble floors and tailored tuxedos, across diamonds and silk and the carefully curated illusion of power. Ethan Cole stood at the center of it all, effortless, controlled, every inch the man who had built something the world respected, or at least feared, his glass raised just slightly higher than everyone else's, his smile measured, practiced, perfect. The room leaned toward him the way rooms always did, drawn by money, by confidence, by the gravity of a man who believed he owned every outcome in sight. He didn't look back. He never did. Not at the past. Not at the people he had outgrown, or dismissed, or quietly erased. And yet, at the very edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the chandelier's brightest light, she stood. Clara Whitmore. Unnoticed. Unannounced. A silhouette in a simple black dress that didn't beg for attention and didn't need to. Her heels were low, practical, the kind that didn't slow you down when you had somewhere real to go, and her hair fell in soft, unbothered waves, untouched by the frantic perfection that filled the rest of the room. No one turned when she entered. No whispers followed her. No curious glances lingered. It was as if she were invisible. And for a long time, she had been. 5 years ago, her name had been spoken differently, usually attached to his, Clara Cole, said with polite admiration, with the quiet assumption that she was part of his success, a background detail in the portrait he presented to the world. But portraits can be repainted. Frames can be replaced. And people, when they stop being useful, can disappear. That was the story Ethan believed. That was the story he told without ever saying it out loud. Clara had learned not to correct him. Not then. Not when the papers were signed and the silence that followed was louder than any argument. Not when the friends stopped calling, their loyalty dissolving as easily as ice in a glass of bourbon. Not when she packed her life into boxes that felt too light for everything she had lost. She hadn't corrected anyone. She had simply stepped back. Quietly. Patiently. And while the world watched Ethan rise, watched his company expand across markets and headlines, watched him become the version of himself he had always promised he would be, no one watched her. No one saw the small apartment with its narrow windows and second-hand desk, the hum of an old laptop that ran hotter than it should, the late nights measured not in hours but in deadlines and rejection emails that arrived at 2 a.m. like clockwork. No one saw the way she rebuilt herself piece by piece, skill by skill, contract by contract, learning how to exist without being someone else's reflection. No one noticed when her name began to appear in places that didn't circle back to him, on documents, on proposals, on quiet deals that didn't make headlines but moved money just the same. And standing there now, at the edge of his world, Clara didn't look at Ethan the way she used to. There was no ache, no hesitation, no need to be seen by him at all. Her gaze moved past him, through the crowd, toward the stage where the night's final announcement would be made, the one everyone was waiting for, the one Ethan believed belonged to him. He adjusted his cufflinks, unaware, already anticipating the applause, already rehearsing the modest smile he would give when his name was called. Clara's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her glass, steady, controlled, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips, not for him, not for the room, but for the moment that was about to arrive. Because the truth was simple, and it had always been simple. He thought she had stayed small. He had no idea she had been building something he couldn't even see. Not yet. The applause swelled again as Ethan stepped down from the stage, the sound wrapping around him like a tailored coat, warm and familiar, the kind of approval he had learned to expect, to depend on. his fingers brushing the stem of his glass as he moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting compliments, every word directed at him reinforcing the same belief he had carried for years that he had built this, that he alone had earned this moment. And somewhere behind him, unnoticed, Clara watched the orbit he had created, the way people leaned in when he spoke, the way they laughed a fraction too quickly at his jokes, the way admiration followed him like a shadow. And it almost felt distant now, like something she had once studied but no longer needed to understand, because she had built something quieter, something that did not require an audience to exist, something that did not disappear when the room emptied. And for a brief second the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume faded into memory, replaced by the hum of a small apartment late at night, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across scattered papers, the sound of her keyboard steady and relentless as the hours slipped past midnight, back when every decision mattered more than sleep, when every email carried weight, when rejection was not an exception but a pattern she learned to move through without breaking. She remembered the first contract she secured, barely enough to cover rent. The client hesitant, skeptical, unaware that she was building something far beyond what they saw. She remembered the silence after sending proposals into the void, the way doubt would press against her ribs in the early hours of the morning, asking the same question again and again, "Are you enough without him?" And she never answered out loud. She simply kept going, quietly, patiently, because she understood something Ethan never had. That power did not always arrive with recognition, that sometimes it moved in silence, signing agreements no one talked about, acquiring pieces of something larger without ever announcing its presence, and slowly, without spectacle, her name began to exist in places that mattered, on documents that shifted ownership, on investments that grew roots beneath companies that believed they were standing on solid ground. And one of those companies, the one Ethan now celebrated as his greatest success, had begun to change long before tonight, long before the applause, long before the speech he had rehearsed in front of mirrors and boardrooms. Piece by piece, share by share, it had been moving into different hands, into her hands, though no one had thought to look closely enough to see it, because why would they? Clara Whitmore was not a name anyone expected to matter anymore, not in his world, not in rooms like this, and yet here she was, standing, at the edge of it all, holding the quiet weight of everything she had built, her fingers steady against the cool glass, her breathing even, her gaze fixed not on Ethan but on the stage ahead where the final announcement would soon be made, the one he believed would crown his success, the one he thought would confirm what he had always told himself about who he was and who she had become. And for the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself a single, quiet thought, not bitter, not angry, just certain. Every step he took tonight, every victory he believed was his, had already been written long before he walked into this room, and he had signed it himself without ever knowing who stood on the other side of the page. The music softened just enough for the room to shift its attention, the subtle change in tempo signaling something important was about to happen, and conversations tapered into a low murmur as eyes turned toward the stage once more, anticipation settling into the air like a held breath. And Ethan adjusted his jacket instinctively, already preparing himself, already imagining the next round of applause, the recognition, the validation that would seal the night as his, because in his mind there was no other outcome. There never had been, not since the first deal closed, not since the headlines started using his name with words like visionary and unstoppable. And yet as the host stepped forward, smiling with practiced ease, there was a pause. Just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to create a ripple of curiosity through the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host began, voice smooth and measured. "Tonight we celebrate not just growth, but transformation, and behind every transformation, there is someone who sees what others overlook." A few heads tilted, a few brows furrowed. Ethan's smile remained, but something in his eyes flickered, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if a detail had shifted just slightly out of place. "The acquisition we are honoring tonight," the host continued, "would not have been possible without a lead investor whose vision has quietly shaped every step of this journey." And there it was, a single word that did not belong in Ethan's version of events, quietly. It echoed in the space between his thoughts, unfamiliar, unwelcome, And for the first time that evening, his certainty hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to matter. "Please join me in welcoming," the host said, turning toward the side of the stage, "Clara Whitmore." And the name did not land all at once. It moved through the room in layers, confusion first, then recognition, then something sharper, something heavier, as heads turned, as whispers sparked and spread. And Ethan's glass stilled in his hand, the faint clink against his ring, cutting through the silence louder than it should have. And she stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, each step measured, grounded, as if she had walked this path 100 times before in rooms that did not need to announce her to validate her presence. The light caught her just enough to bring her fully into view, no longer a silhouette, no longer invisible. And for a moment the entire room recalibrated around her. The woman no one had noticed now standing exactly where everyone was, looking, and Ethan's gaze locked onto her, disbelief unfolding slowly across his face. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet fracture in the image he had built of the world, because nothing about this fit, not the name, not the moment, not the realization that followed with unbearable clarity. Every contract, every expansion, every success he had celebrated had not been entirely his, not even close. And Clara reached the stage, accepting the microphone with a calm that did not need to prove itself, her fingers steady, her expression composed. And when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear and precise, cutting through the room without force. "Thank you," she said, a simple acknowledgement, no performance, no embellishment, just truth delivered without urgency. Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd before settling, just for a second, on him, and in that second there was no accusation, no anger, only recognition. The kind that comes from understanding something completely and no longer needing anything from it. "Some things," she continued, her tone even, almost reflective, "are built best when no one is watching." A pause followed, not for effect, but because nothing more needed to be rushed, and somewhere in that silence, the entire room understood what Ethan had not seen for years. That while he had been performing success, she had been creating it, quietly, patiently, and the applause that followed was different, not louder, but deeper, more deliberate, as if the room itself had shifted its allegiance without needing to say it out loud. And Ethan stood there, still, the weight of the moment settling around him, not crushing, not dramatic, just undeniable, because for the first time, he was no longer the center of the story, and he had no idea when that had changed. The applause lingered longer than expected, not explosive but sustained, as if the room was recalibrating in real time, shifting its center of gravity from one figure to another without quite knowing how it had happened. And Clara stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not basking in it, not absorbing it, simply allowing it to exist before she stepped back, handing the microphone to the host with a quiet nod, her movements precise, unhurried, as if nothing about this moment required urgency, because for her, it did not. This had already happened long before tonight, long before the lights, long before the recognition, and as she stepped off the stage, the space seemed to part for her in a way it never had before, conversations lowering, eyes following, curiosity replacing indifference, and across the room Ethan remained where he was, his posture still composed but no longer effortless, the subtle tension in his shoulders betraying something he could not immediately control, his mind moving quickly, retracing steps, replaying decisions, searching for the moment where things had shifted without his awareness, because that was the part he could not accept, not the outcome, not the loss of control, but the fact that it had happened without him noticing. And as Clara moved through the crowd, people approached her now, voices careful, respectful, asking questions that carried a different tone than the ones they had directed at her years ago. This time there was no assumption attached to her name, no quiet dismissal, only recognition that she was someone they needed to understand, and she answered them simply, without embellishment, without lingering, her focus already elsewhere, because this was not the point. This was only the surface of something much larger, and then, inevitably, the distance between them closed, not by intention but by the natural pull of a room that had just witnessed a shift in power. Ethan stepped forward, just enough to intercept her path, not blocking, not confrontational, but present, his voice lower when he spoke, stripped of the projection he had used on stage. "Clara," he said, her name unfamiliar in his mouth, as if he had not spoken it in years and was only now realizing how little he understood it. She paused, not out of obligation, but because there was no reason not to, her gaze meeting his evenly, no hesitation, no flicker of the past lingering behind her eyes, just clarity, and for a second neither of them spoke, the noise of the room, fading into something distant, replaced by the quiet weight of everything that had gone unsaid between them. Ethan exhaled slowly, searching for the right entry point, something that would restore balance, something that would make sense of what had just happened. "You could have said something," he began, the words careful, almost measured, as if he was negotiating terms he did not fully understand, and Clara's expression did not change, not defensive, not amused, simply present. "About what?" she asked, her tone neutral, not challenging, just direct, and that question settled between them in a way that forced him to hear it fully, because there was no easy answer, no version of the past he could reshape in that moment to justify what he had not seen, what he had chosen not to see, and for the first time, Ethan realized that the silence he had once interpreted as absence had never been empty at all. It had been filled with something he had not taken the time to understand, and Clara held his gaze for a second longer before stepping past him, not dismissive, not dramatic, simply continuing forward, because there was nothing left there for her to resolve, nothing left to prove, and behind her, Ethan remained where he was, the noise of the room returning around him, louder now, but somehow less certain, because everything he thought he knew about control, about visibility, about what mattered, had just shifted, and he was only beginning to understand that the story he had been telling himself all these years had never been the whole story at all. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened quietly, almost unnoticed beneath the hum of conversation, and a thin ribbon of cool night air slipped inside, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and city pavement, and Clara stepped through without looking back, her pace steady, unhurried, the sound of her heels soft against polished floors, fading as she moved farther from the light, farther from the noise that had once defined everything she thought mattered, and behind her the room continued, laughter returning in uneven waves, voices slightly louder now as if trying to reclaim something that had shifted beyond repair, and Ethan remained where she had left him, his glass still in hand, though he had not taken a sip, the condensation warming against his fingers as time passed in a way he could suddenly feel, each second stretching just enough to make him aware of it, of himself, of the space he occupied without quite controlling it anymore. And he turned, slowly at first, his gaze drawn toward the exit she had taken, toward the absence she left behind, and for the first time in years, the room did not follow him when he moved, attention no longer tethered to his presence, drifting instead toward conversations he was no longer part of, and the realization settled quietly, not sharp, not immediate, but persistent, like a truth that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And he set the glass down on a passing tray, the faint clink barely audible before, making his way toward the doors, not out of impulse, but out of something he could not fully name, a need to close the distance, to understand what had unfolded beyond the surface of a single moment. And outside, the night stretched wide, the city lights reflecting off damp pavement in long, shimmering lines, the air cooler, clearer, untouched by the curated warmth of the ballroom, and Clara stood near the curb, waiting, not restless, not distracted, simply present, her gaze lifted toward the skyline as if measuring something invisible, something only she could see. And when Ethan approached, his footsteps slowed just slightly, the confidence that once defined his movements replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. "Clara," he said again, her name steadier this time, though still unfamiliar in its weight, and she turned, meeting his eyes with the same calm clarity, the same absence of expectation that had unsettled him moments before, and for a second the city noise filled the space between them, distant traffic, the low hum of engines, the faint echo of voices from the street, grounding the moment in something real, something outside the polished world they had just left, and Ethan exhaled, the breath visible in the cool air, his words slower now, chosen rather than assumed. "I did not know." he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a statement that felt incomplete the moment it left him, and Clara tilted her head slightly, considering it, not dismissing, not accepting, simply acknowledging it as it was. No, she replied softly. You did not. And there was no edge to it, no accusation, just truth delivered without weight. And it lingered between them, uncomplicated and undeniable, and Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, not at the version he remembered, not at the role she once played in his life, but at the person standing in front of him now, self-contained, composed, no longer orbiting anything but her own center, and something in that realization shifted, subtle but irreversible, because for the first time he understood that what he had lost was not something he could measure in deals or headlines, not something he could reclaim with strategy or timing. It was something he had never taken the time to see, and Clara glanced toward the street as a car pulled up, its headlights cutting briefly through the dark, before returning her attention to him for one final moment. Take care, Ethan, she said, the words simple, without implication, without invitation, just a quiet closing of something that had already ended long ago. And as she stepped forward, opening the door and slipping inside, the city swallowed the moment as easily as it had created it, the car pulling away, its taillights fading into the distance, leaving Ethan standing under the open sky, the noise of the world continuing around him, unchanged, and yet nothing felt the same, because somewhere between the silence he had ignored and the success he had claimed, the story had moved on without him, and he was only now beginning to understand that he had never been the one writing it. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, taxis sliding past in streaks of yellow light, people laughing on sidewalks, doors opening and closing with quiet finality, and Ethan remained there for a moment longer than necessary, his hands in his pockets, the cool air settling into his lungs in a way that felt sharper than it should have, because the noise of the night could not quite cover the silence that had formed inside his thoughts. And when he finally turned, stepping back toward the building, the glass doors reflected a version of himself that felt subtly unfamiliar, still composed, still controlled, but no longer unquestioned. And inside, the ballroom carried on, though something had shifted beneath the surface. Conversations now threaded with a different kind of curiosity, glances lingering a second longer, names being spoken with new context. And as Ethan re-entered, he noticed it immediately. The way people looked at him, not with less respect, but with more calculation, as if recalibrating where he stood in a structure they thought they understood, and he moved through it with the same practiced ease, nodding, acknowledging, answering questions that came too quickly and with too much interest. We did not know she was involved, someone said, half laughing, half uncertain, and Ethan gave a small, controlled smile, the kind that revealed nothing while suggesting everything was exactly as it should be. Neither did I, he replied, the honesty slipping out before he could reshape it, and the words lingered longer than intended, creating a brief pause that no one quite knew how to fill. And as the night continued, he found himself listening more than speaking, absorbing fragments of conversations, investors mentioning her name with quiet respect, analysts referencing decisions that now made more sense, timelines that aligned differently when viewed from her perspective rather than his. And piece by piece, the narrative he had carried began to shift, not collapsing, but rearranging into something he had not anticipated. And hours later, when the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed slightly, Ethan found himself alone near the edge of the room where she had stood earlier, the same place he had never noticed before, and he looked at it differently now, not as a corner, but as a vantage point, a place from which everything could be seen without being part of it. And for the first time, he understood the advantage of being overlooked, of moving without attention, of building without interference, and the realization was not comfortable, but it was clear, because everything he had chased had required visibility, validation, recognition, while everything she had built had required none of those things. And somewhere in that contrast, the balance of power had shifted without announcement, without spectacle, without him ever seeing it happen. And as he left the building for the second time that night, the city no longer felt like a stage, but something else entirely, something larger, something that did not revolve around him. And in the quiet of that realization, one thought surfaced, simple and unavoidable, He had spent years believing he was ahead, believing he was leading, when in truth, he had only been moving in the direction everyone could see, while she had been moving somewhere else entirely, somewhere that did not need to be seen to exist, and for the first time, he did not know where that place was, or how far ahead she already was within it. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of light stretching across the city as if nothing from the night before had mattered, as if no balance had shifted, no story had quietly rewritten itself beneath crystal chandeliers and practiced smiles. And yet for Ethan, the day did not begin where it usually did. There was no immediate rush of calls, no instinctive reach for his phone to scan headlines or numbers or confirmations of momentum. Instead, there was a pause, subtle but persistent, as if his thoughts needed a moment to realign before moving forward. And when he finally stepped into his office, the familiar space felt slightly altered, not physically. Everything was exactly where it had always been: the polished desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline, the quiet hum of climate control maintaining a perfect, unchanging environment. But something in the way he saw it had shifted, as if the room no longer confirmed what he believed about himself, but simply reflected it back for reconsideration, and his assistant greeted him with the same efficiency, the same composed tone. "You have 3 calls scheduled and a briefing on the acquisition," she said, handing him a folder, and the word acquisition landed differently now. Heavier, more complex, carrying layers he had not accounted for before, and he nodded, taking the folder, his fingers pausing for a fraction of a second on the cover before opening it. And as he scanned the pages, numbers and projections laid out with clinical precision, there it was, her name, not highlighted, not emphasized, but present, embedded in the structure of everything he had been celebrating: Clara Whitmore, listed among entities and signatures that had shaped the deal from the inside out. And he leaned back slightly, the chair absorbing the shift in his weight, his gaze lingering on the line longer than necessary, not because he did not understand it, but because he finally did, and the understanding came with a quiet clarity that did not require explanation. She had not stepped into his world last night. She had already been there, long before he noticed, long before he thought to look, and the realization moved through him without resistance, not defensive, not reactive, simply accepted as truth. And as the day unfolded, meeting after meeting, conversation after conversation, the same pattern emerged: references to decisions he had once attributed solely to his own strategy, now traced back to influences he had not seen, subtle shifts in direction that made more sense when viewed through her perspective. And for the first time, Ethan found himself asking different questions: not how to maintain control, not how to stay ahead, but how he had missed something so foundational, how he had overlooked the quiet architecture that had been shaping outcomes all along. And in the spaces between those questions, memory surfaced, not as regret, but as recognition: moments he had dismissed, conversations he had not fully heard, the way she had once observed more than she spoke, the way she had noticed details others ignored. And it became clear that nothing about her presence now was sudden. Nothing about her position was accidental. It had all been built with intention, with patience, with a kind of focus that did not need acknowledgement to sustain itself. And as the afternoon light shifted across his office, casting longer shadows against the glass, Ethan closed the folder, his hand resting on it for a moment, not as a gesture of ownership, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something he was only beginning to understand: that success, the kind that lasts, is not always the one that announces itself the loudest. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of his immediate view, Clara was already moving forward, not waiting, not watching, simply continuing along a path she had chosen long before he realized it existed. And for the first time, Ethan understood that catching up was not about speed. It was about seeing what had always been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knew where to look. The rhythm of the days that followed did not slow down, but it changed, subtly at first, then unmistakably, as if the tempo Ethan had always relied on had been recalibrated without his permission. Meetings still filled his schedule, decisions still moved through his hands, numbers still climbed across reports in clean, upward lines, and yet beneath all of it, there was a quiet awareness he could not ignore, a sense that he was no longer operating at the center of something he fully understood. And it was not a loss of control that unsettled him. It was the realization that control had never meant what he thought it did, because while he had been directing what was visible, something else had been shaping what mattered, and now he could see it, not clearly, not completely, but enough to know it had always been there, and across the city, in a building that did not announce itself with glass or height. Clara sat at a desk that did not need to impress anyone, the space around her simple, intentional, the kind of environment that supported focus rather than performance, sunlight filtering through wide windows, settling across documents arranged with quiet precision. And her phone buzzed occasionally, not with noise, not with urgency, but with information that moved things forward, and she moved through it all with the same measured pace, reviewing, deciding, adjusting. Each action part of a structure she had built piece by piece, without spectacle, without the need to prove anything to anyone watching, because no one had been watching, not in the beginning, not when the first decisions were made that would later reshape entire outcomes. And even now, attention did not alter her process. It did not accelerate her. It did not distract her. It simply existed at the edges, irrelevant to the work itself. And as she signed off on another report, her name placed with quiet certainty at the bottom of the page, the movement was almost identical to the countless signatures that had come before, steady, deliberate, unremarkable in isolation, and yet each one carried weight that extended far beyond the paper it touched. And back in his office, Ethan found himself pausing more often, not out of hesitation, but out of consideration, reading beyond the surface, asking questions that did not come naturally to him before, tracing the structure beneath decisions rather than assuming their direction. And it became clear that influence was not always declared. It was often embedded, woven into systems in ways that did not require acknowledgement to function. And the more he looked, the more he saw it. Patterns that had once felt like his own intuition now revealing a different origin. A quieter intelligence that had guided outcomes without ever stepping into the light. And late in the afternoon, as the city shifted into the softer tones of early evening, Ethan stood by the window, the skyline stretching out in front of him, familiar and yet no longer entirely his, and he realized something that did not arrive as a shock, but as a quiet, undeniable truth, that the distance between them was not measured in time or opportunity. It was measured in perspective, in the way they had each chosen to build. He had built outward, visible, immediate, designed to be seen and recognized, while she had built inward, foundational, designed to last whether anyone noticed or not. And that difference had changed everything long before either of them stood in that ballroom, long before her name was spoken into a microphone, long before he understood that the story he believed he was leading had always been shaped by someone who never needed to stand at the center to define it. And somewhere across the city, without urgency, without announcement, Clara continued, already focused on what came next, already moving beyond the moment that had only just begun to redefine his understanding of everything he thought he knew. The pattern did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly, in fragments that only made sense when Ethan stopped looking for confirmation and started looking for truth. And it began with a meeting that should have been routine, a discussion about expansion into a new market, projections laid out, risks assessed, opportunities framed in the same language he had used for years, confident, structured, familiar. And yet something felt different, not in the numbers, but in the direction they pointed, as if the path forward had already been quietly defined before he arrived at the table. And when he asked a question, simple, direct, who initiated this shift, there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, but telling. And one of the analysts responded carefully, it aligns with the framework introduced last quarter. And Ethan nodded, because he remembered that framework. He remembered approving it, but he did not remember creating it. And that distinction, subtle as it was, lingered longer than it should have. And later, alone in his office, he traced it back, document by document, decision by decision, until the structure became visible in a way it never had before. Not as a series of isolated choices, but as a design, deliberate, consistent, and undeniably precise. And at the center of that design, not highlighted, not emphasized, but present in a way that could not be ignored, was her influence, not loud, not declared, but embedded in the logic of every outcome. And he leaned back in his chair, the city stretching out behind him in long lines of light and glass. And for the first time, the view did not feel like something he commanded, but something he observed. And the shift was not unsettling in the way he expected. It was clarifying, because it removed something he had been holding without realizing it. The assumption that visibility equaled authorship, that presence equaled control. And as the afternoon faded into evening, the realization settled into something more defined, something that did not need to be argued or defended, only understood. And across the city, Clara moved through her own day with the same quiet precision. A series of decisions that did not announce themselves, meetings that did not require recognition, conversations that were direct and efficient, focused on what needed to be done rather than how it would be perceived. And when a colleague mentioned the event from the night before, referencing the shift it had caused, the attention it had drawn, Clara listened, acknowledging it with a small nod. But her focus did not linger there, because for her, that moment had already passed. It had never been the destination, only a point along a path she had been following for years. And as she reviewed the next set of reports, her attention moved forward, not backward, because what she was building did not depend on what had already been revealed. It depended on what had not yet been seen. And back in his office, Ethan stood once more by the window, the reflection of his own image faint against the glass, layered over the city beyond. And he considered something he had not allowed himself to consider before, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as a possibility, that the distance between them was not fixed, that understanding did not require undoing what had been done, only seeing it clearly. And the thought did not come with urgency. It came with a quiet sense of direction, because for the first time, he was not trying to stay ahead of something. He was trying to understand it. And in that shift, something else became clear, that the story he believed he was leading had never been about dominance or control. It had always been about perspective, about what you choose to see and what you overlook. And as the city lights deepened into the night, Ethan remained there for a moment longer, not searching for answers, but recognizing that the right questions had only just begun to form. And somewhere beyond his view, Clara was already several steps ahead, not because she moved faster, but because she had been moving with intention all along. The invitation arrived without urgency, a simple message placed among a dozen others in Ethan's inbox, clean, direct, almost understated in its tone, and yet it stood out in a way he could not immediately explain, not because of what it said, but because of who it came from. Clara Whitmore, her name appearing without embellishment, without introduction, as if it no longer needed context to carry weight. And for a moment he did not open it, his cursor hovering over the subject line, aware that whatever waited inside would not be complicated, but it would be precise. And when he finally clicked, the message unfolded with the same clarity she had carried into every space he had seen her in since that night. We are finalizing the next phase of the restructuring. I thought it would be useful for you to see it from the inside. If you are available, join us tomorrow at 10. No excess, no implication, no attempt to persuade. Just an invitation that assumed nothing and offered everything. And Ethan leaned back slightly, reading it again, not because he misunderstood it, but because he recognized what it represented, not a correction, not a confrontation, but a shift, a door opening not out of necessity, but out of choice. And the next morning, the building he entered did not resemble the spaces he was used to. There were no towering glass facades, no sweeping entrances designed to impress, just a clean, intentional structure that felt grounded, functional, built for purpose rather than perception. And inside, the atmosphere mirrored that same clarity, movement without noise, conversations without performance, every detail aligned with a kind of efficiency that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And when Clara stepped into the room, there was no introduction, no shift in tone, just a continuation of something already in motion, her presence integrated into the space rather than elevated above it. And she acknowledged him with a brief nod, nothing more, as if his presence was neither surprising nor necessary, simply accepted. And the meeting began without pause. Information moving quickly, but not chaotically, each point building on the last, forming a structure that was both complex and completely coherent. And as Ethan listened, something became clear in a way it never had before. This was not reactive. This was not adaptation. This was design. long-term, layered, intentional. And he could see it now. The same patterns he had traced in fragments were fully visible here, connected, purposeful, undeniable. And when Clara spoke, it was not to dominate the room, not to assert control, but to guide it. Her words precise, measured, each one carrying weight because it was necessary, not because it was emphasized. And at one point, she turned slightly toward him, not calling attention, just including him in the flow. "You built momentum," she said, her tone even, factual. "This builds continuity." And the distinction settled quietly, not as a correction, but as a completion, and Ethan nodded, understanding more in that moment than he had in the weeks before, because for the first time, he was not observing from the outside. He was seeing the structure from within. And it was not what he expected. It was more stable, more deliberate, less dependent on fluctuation. And as the meeting continued, the realization deepened that what she had created did not replace what he had done. It reframed it, integrated it into something larger, something that did not rely on visibility to sustain itself. And when it ended, there was no conclusion, no summary, just a natural pause as people moved on to the next thing. The work continuing without needing to be acknowledged, and Clara gathered her notes with the same quiet precision, glancing toward him briefly, not questioning, not confirming, simply aware. And in that moment, Ethan understood something that did not arrive as a revelation, but as a quiet certainty, that the distance between them was no longer defined by what he did not know, but by what he was now beginning to see. And for the first time, the path forward did not feel like something he needed to control, but something he needed to understand. And somewhere within that understanding, a new version of the story was beginning to take shape, one that neither of them needed to announce for it to be real. The room had emptied without ceremony, conversations dissolving into smaller fragments as people returned to their own priorities, their own timelines, leaving behind only the quiet hum of a space that had served its purpose and moved on. And Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, the chair still angled slightly toward the table where everything had just unfolded, not because he needed more information, but because he was processing something that did not rely on data, something that could not be summarized in reports or projections. And across from him, Clara closed her folder with a soft, deliberate motion, the kind that signaled completion without finality, as if nothing in her work was ever truly finished, only continued. And she stood, her posture relaxed but grounded, not waiting for acknowledgement, not expecting response, simply transitioning into what came next. And Ethan watched her for a second, not as he once had, not through the lens of familiarity or assumption, but with a clarity that felt new, because for the first time he was not trying to place her within his understanding of the world. He was adjusting that understanding to account for her presence within it. And when he finally stood, the movement felt less automatic, more intentional, as if each step required a level of awareness he had not needed before. And as they walked toward the exit, the hallway stretched out in clean, quiet lines, sunlight filtering in from distant windows, softening the edges of everything it touched. And for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but complete, holding everything that had been understood without needing to be said. And then Ethan broke it, not with certainty, not with authority, but with something quieter. "You knew," he said, his voice steady but reflective, not accusing, not questioning, simply acknowledging a truth he had only recently begun to grasp. And Clara glanced at him briefly, her expression unchanged, her pace even. "I understood," she replied, the distinction subtle but significant, and it settled between them with a clarity that required no further explanation, because knowing implies control, implies prediction, while understanding allows for movement, for adaptation, for patience. And Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing that difference, recognizing how much of his past had been built on knowing, on certainty, on the belief that if he could see something clearly enough, he could direct it. And now, walking beside someone who had built everything on understanding instead, the contrast felt undeniable, not threatening, but transformative. And as they reached the exit, the doors opening automatically with a soft mechanical whisper, the outside air greeted them with a quiet steadiness. The city continuing its rhythm without interruption, and Clara paused just briefly, not to linger, but to orient, her gaze lifting toward the street as if aligning herself with something only she could feel, and Ethan found himself speaking again, not out of necessity, but out of something deeper. "I thought I was ahead," he said, the words simple, stripped of performance, and Clara looked at him then, fully, her eyes clear, not dismissing, not correcting, just seeing him as he was in that moment. "You were," she said, her tone calm, "just not in the direction that lasts." And there was no judgment in it, no satisfaction, just truth delivered with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else. And it lingered, not heavy, not sharp, but grounding, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath carrying something with it, something unspoken that he no longer needed to hold. And for the first time, the idea of moving forward did not feel like reclaiming something lost. It felt like stepping into something he had never fully understood before. And Clara gave a small nod, not as a conclusion, but as acknowledgement, before stepping away, her path already clear, her pace unchanged, and as she moved into the flow of the city, blending seamlessly into a world that did not need to recognize her to be shaped by her. Ethan remained there for a moment, watching not her, but the space she left behind, the quiet absence that carried more presence than anything he had chased before, and in that stillness, one realization settled fully into place, not as a revelation, but as a foundation, that the most powerful shifts do not demand attention. They redefine everything without asking to be seen, and once you recognize them, you can never return to the way you understood the world before. The city did not pause to acknowledge understanding. It simply continued, traffic lights shifting from red to green, footsteps echoing along sidewalks, glass doors opening and closing in quiet rhythm, and Clara moved through it all with the same steady pace, her presence unforced, unannounced, as if she belonged exactly where she was without needing to prove it. And inside her office, the day unfolded with quiet precision, a sequence of decisions that did not compete for attention, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, her desk uncluttered, her focus uninterrupted, the kind of environment that allowed clarity to exist without resistance. And as she reviewed a new set of projections, her gaze moved across the numbers not as something to react to, but as something to refine, adjust, align, because for her, nothing was static. Everything was part of a larger structure that extended beyond the immediate, and when a colleague stepped in with a question, her response was immediate, not rushed, but exact, each word carrying intention without excess. And the conversation ended as efficiently as it began, leaving no residue, no uncertainty, just direction. And across the city, Ethan stood once again in his office, but the way he occupied the space had changed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally, the way he moved through information, the way he approached decisions, the way he paused before speaking, all of it carried a new awareness. Not hesitation, but consideration, and when his assistant handed him another report, he did not scan it for confirmation. He read it for structure, tracing the logic beneath the surface, understanding not just what it said, but how it had been shaped, and in that shift, something began to settle into place, not a loss of identity, but an expansion of it, because for the first time, he was not defining success by how it appeared, but by how it functioned, how it sustained itself without constant reinforcement. And later that afternoon, when he stepped outside, the city felt different. Again, not because it had changed, but because he had. The noise no longer competing for his attention, the movement no longer demanding his presence, everything simply existing as it was, and he walked without urgency, without the need to arrive anywhere specific, allowing the space between moments to exist without filling it. And somewhere in that quiet, the realization deepened, not as a sudden thought, but as something that had been forming all along, that what Clara had built was not just a structure of influence. It was a way of moving through the world that did not depend on recognition to validate it. And that was something he had never truly understood before, because everything he had created had been tied, in some way, to being seen, to being acknowledged, to being known. And now, standing in a world that no longer revolved around that idea, he could see the difference clearly, not as a comparison, but as a contrast that redefined everything he thought he knew. And as the evening settled in, lights flickering on one by one across the skyline. Ethan paused at the edge of the street, watching the reflection of those lights ripple across passing windows, and for the first time, there was no urgency in him, no need to reclaim, no need to compete, just a quiet understanding that the direction forward was not about returning to what he had been, but about stepping into something he had only just begun to see. And somewhere beyond his immediate view, Clara continued as she always had, not looking back, not waiting, simply moving forward with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every unseen moment, every unrecognized step, until the world finally caught up to something that had never needed its attention in the first place.